Namaskar. Today we will be beginning with the fourth module of our course on sales and distribution management, and in this particular module we will be speaking about three important topics. One is the buyer-seller dyad. The second topic which we shall be discussing in this module is the diversity of personal selling situations, and the third topic which we shall discuss in this module is the various theories of selling. So, in this particular lecture, which is lecture 16, which is the first lecture of the fourth module, we shall be talking about buyer-seller dyads. So, what are the various concepts which we will cover in this particular lecture? One, we shall be talking about the meaning of a buyer-seller dyad. Two, we shall be talking about how dyadic relationships take place between salespersons and buyers, and we shall be discussing a model on this particular salesperson-buyer dyadic relationship. So, let us first start with what we mean by a buyer-seller dyad. Now, understanding salesmanship requires an examination of how a buyer and a seller interact with each other, or how buyers and sellers interact with one another. Now, when we talk about buyers, these buyers could be existing buyers who are your already existing buyers of your brand, of your product, and those who have been using your product. They could also be those who are non-users of your product, or maybe they are users of your product but of a competitive brand. So, what we are talking of is that a prospective buyer or a potential buyer. So, when we talk of this relationship here between the buyer and the seller, we include both actual and existing buyers. We also include the prospective or the potential buyers. So, this understanding the interactions between the buyer and the seller, whether the buyer is an actual buyer or he is a potential, is very, very important, because when we speak about selling, or when we speak about personal selling, we have discussed that it also involves cultivation of relationships. One, it is a basis for a transaction. Two, it is also a cultivation of relationships. So, whether a salesperson is intending a transaction or a sale, or whether he is intending long-term sales, long-term profits, for which relationships are necessary, in both these cases the salesperson must have a proper understanding of the consumer, or of the client, or of the segment at large. So, he must understand the buyers, he must understand the existing buyers, or and the potential buyers. Similarly, the buyers also need to have an understanding of the marketer, of the seller, of the salesperson. And so, whether it is a sale which is the immediate purpose from the end of the seller, or it is the purchase which is the immediate purpose from the end of the buyer, or whether it is long-term cultivation of relationships between the buyer and the seller, both require that there is a fruitful interaction between the buyer and the seller. And so, when we talk about salesmanship, salesmanship also requires an understanding of how buyers and sellers interact with one another, not only for the purpose of making an immediate sale, but also for cultivation of relationships in the long term. So, in a business environment, buyers and sellers, they interact with one another, and this interaction takes place when they both realize that they have a common objective, in the sense that the buyer has a need which translates into a want, and which will help satisfy him, help him satisfy a particular need. On the other hand, the seller or the marketer also has a need, which is sustained profits. And so, when they both realize that they have something mutually beneficial for each other, the buyer has the money and the salesperson or the seller has a product or a service which he can exchange for that money, so that both parties benefit out of this transaction. So, it is only when this kind of a feeling exists that both parties have something to offer to each other, which will help satisfy both of them. It is in this case that the need for an interaction is felt, and this particular interaction paves the way for successful transactions and long-term relationships. So, in a business environment, buyers and sellers interact with one another when they realize that this interaction is something which is very crucial for reaching mutually satisfying goals. As I said, the goals being a product or a service which will help a customer meet a particular need or want, and this is from the perspective of the buyer, and from the perspective of the seller or the marketer, the goal or the objective is to earn profits, to earn sales and revenue. So, this kind of the need for an interaction paves the way for an information exchange, or the requirement of an information exchange for both of them. And the interaction between the buyer and the seller, this exchange of information, this dialogue, this communication that takes place on a common platform constitutes what we refer to as a buyer-seller dyad. Now, it's very important to understand here that this interaction is taking place because both the buyer and the seller, both the parties, have something to offer to each other which is value to the other party, and both want to enter into an exchange process. For the exchange to take place, it is important that there is an interaction between the buyer and the seller, and they both need to understand each other very well. This is what constitutes the dyad. Now, the term dyad has actually been used by sociologists against a backdrop of an interaction between two people, and it actually deals with situations in where two people interact, or two people enter into a communication or a dialogue, and the interaction features around a particular objective or a goal which is mutually beneficial for both parties. So, the interaction between the buyer and the seller, or between a salesperson and a prospect, would constitute the example of a buyer-seller dyad. This interaction between the buyer and seller could be can also happen through print or through audiovisual media, So, however, this would be one way. Whether a sale would happen or not is not certain. However, in the case of a face-to-face transaction, in the case of a face-to-face or a physical interaction between the two parties, they enter into a dialogue, they communicate with each other, and are able to assess for themselves whether they would enter into an exchange or not. I repeat that the interaction between a seller and a prospect through print or audiovisual media can be another form of interaction, but that would be a monologue, that would not be a dialogue. It would be one way from the marketer's mouth and not from the customer's end, and whether a sale in this case would happen or not would be something which is very uncertain. However, in the case of a physical interaction between the buyer and the seller, or between the salespersons and the prospects, this physical interaction would actually be more a better indicator of each other's reactions to each other. It would be communication via verbal, non-verbal, as well as body language, and so both the prospect and the salesperson would understand each other. They would be able to understand what each other is saying. They would be able to understand the perspectives of each other, and they would also be able to enter into a dialogue where the likelihood of a sale happening would be much higher. Also, whether a prospect would react to the wishes of the seller is totally associated with the nature of interaction between them. So, if there is a face-to-face interaction, it does not actually mean for sure or for certainty that a sale would happen. Whether a prospect would actually become an actual buyer or not, much depends on the kind of interaction that takes place between them, and it is here that salesmanship as an art, as a skill, again assumes huge amount of importance. Now, a major determinant here is of whether an interaction will take place and whether it would be a fruitful interaction or not is the buyer's conditioning with respect to the purchase decision process. So, a major determinant of the buyer-seller dyadic relationship or dyadic interaction is the buyer's conditioning with respect to making purchase decisions, and we can discuss this in the form of a stimulus response model, where a stimulus is presented to the buyer, and there is a response to it. Now, this stimulus is presented to the buyer detects or the stimulus, gives thought to it, and finally responds in a particular manner. Now, in this case, in a dyadic relationship or in a buyer-seller dyadic relationship, for example, a sales presentation may be made by the salesperson. The message becomes important because the message must the content must take into account the need benefit. We should always remember that people do not buy products. Customers do not buy products, they buy the benefit. They look for a benefit in the product, and it is the value here lies in the benefit, and the value here is with respect to how well the product or the service will be able to deliver a benefit and how well that would help satisfy a need or a want. So, it is very important that the salesperson designs his message appropriately, and this message and this as well as his presentation or the manner in which he delivers the message acts as a stimuli. The objective of the salesperson here is to inform the consumer, or whether actual or prospective, about products and services, about the brand, about the features, about the advantages, about the benefits, and then he must also persuade and convince them about the value proposition, and then encourage action in the form of a purchase behavior from the customer's end. So, the salesperson here, via his sales presentation, informs the customers, educates them about the product, about the service, about the brand, and he tries to convince or persuade the customer to enter into an exchange process or to enter into a transaction, which is the sale actually happening. So, it is very important that the salesperson presents the stimulus in a very efficient manner. He must deliver his presentation in a very good way. The presentation must be very impressive, and he must have good communication skills and good interpersonal skills. He should be able to talk about the product, about the service. He should be able to handle queries or objections or any doubts which arise from the customer's end. But it's very important that this message actually talks about the benefit, because and the salesperson must be able to relate the benefit to the need of the consumer. Now, this acts as a stimulus, and the buyer, who is a recipient of this message, actually gives thought to it. He thinks over it, he deliberates over it, and what happens is in his in his black box, or through his cognitive process or through the brain, is the decision making process, where he decides on he evaluates the value proposition compared to other competitive offerings, and then decides and comes up with a response. Now, this response here could again be: 1, buy now, or enter into an exchange process now. 2, it could be buy later, where he is postponing his purchase decision to some time later, so that he would he does not have the money, or he does not have the resources at that point in time, or it may be so that he wants to give it a greater thought, he wants to deliberate more, think more deeply, and then get back. Or another decision or another kind of response from the buyer may be to not buy at all. So, any and all of these could be different kinds of responses from the consumer's end. 1, he buys it, or he enters into an exchange immediately. 2, he would buy it but later, so he postpones his purchase decision process. And 3, he decides to go against the purchase process and decides not to buy it at all. So, to yield or not to yield to the salesperson is a choice decision. And that is how we can well explain it with the stimulus response model, that if the stimulus is presented well, if the sales presentation is made well, if the salesperson is able to inform, educate and persuade the customers in a good manner, an appropriate response, a desirable response in terms of sales and revenue and profit would definitely be elicited. So, it's very important that the salesperson presents a stimulus which is so well presented that there is a favorable response from the end of the consumer. Of course, whether he yields to it or does not yield to it is a choice decision, and we can talk of this a little more here. Now, whether a consumer, existing or potential, would actually yield or not yield to the salesperson would depend upon several things. One is his own values and beliefs, his needs, his motivation, his perceptions, his attitudes, his personality traits. Two, it also varies across decision making styles. So whether the consumer is very rational in his decision making, or whether he is more of emotional, whether he thinks and acts or whether he feels and acts. So it is whether he takes very cognitive decisions or whether he takes very effective decisions is again something which will determine whether the consumer or the prospective consumer yields or does not yield to the salesperson's stimulus. Also, whether the benefits that are being looked into are functional and utilitarian, or whether they are hedonic and symbolic. Now, any and every product has a benefit, and this benefit is what the customer pays for. Some customers would pay for a functional or a utilitarian benefit which relates to product attributes, features, benefits, advantages. So it is more of the functionality which is taken into account, and the consumer's decision with respect to a particular product or a brand is basically based on a functional motive. He decides whether to buy or not, keeping in mind the functionality. On the other hand, there are also consumers who look for symbolic benefits, who look for emotional benefits, or who look for the fun, fantasy associated with a product or with a brand. So whether a consumer yields or does not yield to a salesperson also depends upon the kind of utility he is looking at, the kind of benefit that he is looking at. Is he looking into a functional benefit, or is he looking into symbolic benefits? And whether it is functional or utilitarian or emotional or symbolic or hedonic is one thing. The other thing is that the salesperson must be able to understand what the customer is looking at or looking for, and an intelligent salesperson would be one who would design his presentation or message in a manner which appeals to the particular customer. So if there is a customer who looks for a customer segment which looks for the functionality, and a message has to be designed very differently as compared to another segment which looks for more of a symbolic benefit or a hedonic benefit or an emotional benefit. So whether a consumer yields or does not yield to the salesperson depends not only upon the decision making style, but will also depend upon the kind of utility, the kind of benefit that the consumer is seeking for. Another determinant of whether the buyer would actually yield to the salesperson or not also is the buying situation. Now, in the case of B2B, we have three different kinds of buying situations. We have a straight rebuy, we have a modified rebuy, and we have a new task. A straight rebuy is when the consumer or the client has already bought a product or service or a brand. He already has a vendor in place and he just repeats his order. That is what is referred to as a straight rebuy. A modified rebuy is when the client organization, in the case of a B2B scenario, wants to bring about changes in the product specifications, or in terms of the quantity ordered, or in terms of the quality of the product, or in terms of delivery terms or prices, etc. In such cases, what he goes through is a modified rebuy, and a new task happens when the organization or the client organization is actually buying a product or a service for the very first time. So in the case of new task, the buying process is very, very complex as compared to the modified rebuy or the straight rebuy. Similarly, in the case of B2C, we could have these three different kinds of buying situations, which could be EPS, LPS and RPS. EPS is extensive problem solving, LPS is limited problem solving, and RPS is routinized problem solving. Routinized problem solving is also referred to as routinized response behavior. Now, what is extensive problem solving? Now, whenever a product or a brand is evaluated, consumers have to pay attention to two things. One is the evaluative criteria, and two is the number of different alternatives that are available. Now, because whenever an evaluation takes place, it takes place across alternatives, and two, it takes place on the basis of certain criteria. So what becomes important here for a consumer is, one, to know the different products and or brands available, different options, alternatives available. Two, to know about the various alternative criteria on which these different brands need to be evaluated. So in the case of EPS or extensive problem solving, the consumer is neither aware of the different brands which exist in the market, nor is he aware of the different evaluative criteria which he must use to evaluate or compare these different brands. This is a situation which happens when a consumer is buying a product for the first time, or it is an absolutely new product and he has no idea about it. Okay. The second is what we refer to as a LPS, or a limited problem solving. In the case of a limited problem solving, the product, the consumer has some idea, he has some information, some knowledge about the different alternatives which are available. He also has some idea about the different evaluative criteria that he can use to evaluate the different alternatives, but the list of brands or the kind of evaluative criteria is not updated yet. Neither has he prioritized on his preferences with respect to the different brands. So this requires some kind of an information search and evaluation, some kind of a cognitive or a thought process on the part of the consumer, and so we refer to it as the LPS. A routinized problem solving is when the consumer is aware about the different products, about the different brands. He is also aware of the different criteria on which he must evaluate them, and so it is more of a routine purchase. He does not go through a cognitive process at all. It is more of a routine purchase, a very programmed decision where he does not have to make any evaluation. He does not have to think much. He just has to go in and buy a product. So across these different stages, across these different types, whether it is EPS, LPS or RPS, consumers will behave very, very differently. In the case of EPS, a lot of cognitive thought would go, and a lot of cognitive and thought procedures will go into, but in the case of routinized problem solving, it will be more of a physical activity and a transaction which would take place between a buyer who has already made his choice with respect to a product and a brand, and a seller. So so an adaptive selling style would also has to be used to based on the buyer characteristics, and so it's very important that the salesperson understands these various determinants and accordingly designs an adaptive selling style or uses a adaptive selling style so that he can actually enter into a transaction, into an exchange, and he is able to, and he can ensure that the buyer would yield to his efforts. Now, marketers intend to very optimally utilize the buyer-seller dyad as a way of ensuring that the interaction between the buyer and the seller is very effective, and and it's very result oriented. And so, it's very important that the salespersons are well equipped of knowledge of the sales as well as of the sales related marketing policies, and it is here that knowledge about sales related marketing policies becomes crucial. We have discussed it in the earlier sessions. It's very, very important that the salespersons have good interpersonal skills, they can communicate well, they have a good dialogue delivery, they can actually design a good message, and they can present it well. Most companies intend to ensure that their salespeople undergo a thorough training as a way of enhancing this interaction skill, so that it results in a fruitful interaction between the buyer and the seller. And so the consumers, so the salespeople are made to undergo a thorough training process. They are made to equip themselves with knowledge, with selling skills, and it's very important here that the salesperson is well able to identify the needs of the customers and match their product or service offerings with the needs of the customers and educate customers on the benefits. So what we are talking of is a need benefit match, or a good fit between the need and the benefit must be presented to the customer, and the salespersons must also aim hard at forging and maintaining good relationships. So it's very important that the buyer-seller dyad, in order to be fruitful, it's important that the salesperson is not only well equipped with knowledge about the product, about the sales related marketing policies, but he also has good interpersonal skills, good communication skills, and he has good analytical skills. He can conceptualize problems well, he can understand consumer needs, he can present a good fit or a good match between the product and the customer's need, or the benefit and the customer's need, and he can move ahead to forge good relationships between them. Now let us come to a model of the salesperson-buyer dyadic relationship. The source of this model here is mentioned on this slide. It is proposed by Rosanne L. Spiro, William D. Perrault and Fred D. Reynolds, who have actually presented this model of the salesperson-buyer dyadic relationship, and let us discuss it in greater length. Now, the dyadic relationship starts with the salesperson-customer relationship. It starts with the customer-salesperson relationship. The salesperson and the customer are two different entities. They constitute what we refer to as a dyad. So the salesperson has his own role requirements and his characteristics. Role requirements could pertain to his role, his responsibilities, the autonomy, the authority which he has, and then he has his personal characteristics in the form of his personality, his values, his beliefs, his perceptions, his motivation. And on the other hand, the customer has similar personal characteristics and role requirements. Now, the personal characteristics of the salesperson and of the buyer put together would actually be determining the personal affiliation that develops between the buyer and the seller. So, the personal characteristics play important roles in determining personal affiliation between the two entities in the dyad, and the role requirements and characteristics of the salesperson as well as the personal characteristics of the salesperson lead to his needs and expectations. Similarly, the personal characteristics and the role requirements and characteristics of the consumer lead to his needs and expectations. Now, the needs and expectations of the buyer and the seller need not always be coherent to each other. They may, one of them may have different kinds of needs and expectations from the other entity, and so this requires some level of adjustment between the two entities. Based on the needs and expectations, the seller chooses a particular strategy, and based on his needs and expectations, the buyer also chooses a strategy, and they both agree to negotiate with each other. In case they agree to the terms and conditions which each other has to offer, in case both parties feel that the interaction could be mutually beneficial for both parties, it leads to a negotiation. In case it does not, then there is always a scope to go back to adapt both in terms of role requirements and characteristics for both the parties, whether it is with respect to the buyer or whether it is with respect to the seller, and they could reframe or redesign their strategy and agree to come back to a common platform so that an exchange could take place. Once an exchange takes place, once they both adapt each other, adapt their strategies, an exchange would take place and the process would stop here in terms of a transaction. But for ongoing long-term relationships to happen, there is always an experience which acts as a bigger determinant for future salesperson and buyer dyadic relationship. Experience, both the buyer's experience as well as the seller's experience. So the buyer and seller's experience will again act as a basis for future dyadic relationships between the buyer and the seller. So here, if we see, the model exhibits that the sales process is influenced by both the buyers and the sellers. Both the salesperson and the consumer or the customer are influenced by their personal characteristics as well as the roles, requirements and characteristics. The personal characteristics would include values, beliefs, perceptions, attitudes, past experience, and the role requirements would refer to duties, responsibilities, authority, autonomy. And both of this would together define the needs and expectations, which may not always be mutually which may sometimes be contradictory, and so they need to be adjusted. Based on the needs and expectations, the salesperson and the customer would design a strategy and agree on a conducive exchange via negotiation. If the negotiation does not happen, based on the feedback, both the salesperson and the buyer may adopt alternative strategies to adjust to each other's needs and expectations, and this may again require a change in the role requirements. And however, it is to be noted that such changes may not always be feasible, and whether a dyadic relationship actually is fruitful and beneficial for both the parties or not, much depends upon the needs and requirements, the needs and expectations of both the parties. If it is mutually beneficial, an exchange would happen, an interaction would happen, and based on experience of both the parties, future dyadic relationships between the buyer and the seller would be determined. So this brings us to an end of this particular session. The references are still Kandif, Govoni, Puri, Sales and Distribution Management 2017, Havaldar and Kawale, Sales and Distribution Management, Text and Cases 2017, McGraw-Hill Education, Panda and Sehdev, Sales and Distribution Management, Oxford University Press 2nd edition, and Futrell, Fundamentals of Selling, McGraw-Hill 13th edition. This brings us to an end of the first lecture on the 4th module of the course. In the next lecture, we will be speaking about the next topic, which is diversity of personal selling situations. Thank you.